Well, welcome everybody to this online webinar organized by Nature Physics and the Alan Turing Institute. And we have two experts with us, Michele Ceriotti from EPFL, Switzerland, and Una Kim from Cornell. They are both eminent researchers and experts in machine learning and materials sciences. So we're going to have two 20-minute talks from each of them, and then have questions from the audience and the discussion to round out the last 20 minutes of the hour. So yeah, I think Michele, do you want to go first? And then I'll go second.
Sure. So I'm assuming that you can see my screen.
Yep.
And so thank you, Gabor, for an introduction, and thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to focus my talk on one specific side of machine learning in condensed matter physics. And specifically, I'm going to focus on the problem of using machine learning in the context of atomistic simulations. So atomistic simulations is, something that has been going on since at least the 1960s, and the idea and sort of the hope behind atomistic modeling is to be able to achieve truly predictive modeling of matter by starting from a description of the interaction between the microscopic components of the system. And then the philosophy, so as to speak, is that after having extracted the microscopic properties, let's say the elastic constants or the conductivity, you can feed these into a hierarchy of coarser grained models until you manage to predict how a certain material will behave in a mechanical component or in a device. Now, one of the key challenges, if you want to achieve this level of predictive accuracy, is being able, on one hand, to achieve a very accurate description of the electronic structure of your system. This basically means that you need to solve some very accurate approximation to the Schrödinger equation for one configuration of the nuclei. But at the same time, you also need to average over thermal, quantum fluctuations, disorder, which basically multiply by millions of times the cost of evaluating energies and forces for one configuration. And it is in this repeat evaluation of the properties of the system as it undergoes thermal and quantum fluctuations that machine learning becomes really, really precious as a technique that allows you basically to reach the accuracy of accurate electronic structure calculations, but just paying the cost of some kind of approximate empirical model. So how does this work? Well, it's not really that there is much magic involved. Essentially, let's say that you would use a solution of some approximation of the Schrödinger equation to compute the potential for a configuration of the atoms that basically describe how stable that configuration is and how dynamically it evolves in time. Well, rather than doing explicitly this quantum calculation, you would first train a machine learning model by just computing a small number of reference configurations, and then use this model as a surrogate to achieve the calculation of the potential. And then actually, something that I will touch upon in this presentation, you can compute not only the potential, but also any other property that you would be able to compute by a quantum calculation, even though you might need to make your model a little bit more sophisticated. So to start, I want to kind of give a taste of what are the specifics from a mathematical perspective of the models that are used to describe matter at the atomic scale. So in very abstract terms, if you want to describe a molecule or a condensed matter system, what you need to do is specify the position of the atoms and the nature of the atoms. So from a mathematical perspective, a molecule or a material is nothing but a point cloud characterized by three vectors that give the position of the atoms, and by labels that determine whether each atom is hydrogen, carbon, or whatever else. And an alternative view, which is actually more familiar and more natural to cheminformatics, is to regard a molecule as a graph in which the atoms are vertices, and the bonds or the relationship between atoms form the edges. And actually, of course, there is a lot that has been done for geometric deep learning in this abstract setting, but when we are dealing with atoms and with the physical system, there are additional symmetries and additional requirements that we should incorporate into the model. So for starters, it's usually very beneficial to have models that are symmetric, meaning here, not that they fulfill some specific symmetry, but just that if you rigidly translate or rotate a molecule, the value of the energy doesn't change. And so also the prediction of the model shouldn't change when you apply one of these basic symmetries. Another requirement that is usually fulfilled by the relationship between a structure and a quantum mechanical property is a smoothness. So you can compute derivatives, and actually you can also benefit from smoothness in terms of the learning efficiency of the model. So something that at first glance would seem obvious, but actually in conjunction with symmetry is not, is the requirement that the mapping is complete, meaning that if two structures are distinct, it should be possible to predict that they have different properties. This is if they are not related by one of these basic symmetries. And another requirement, which is less obvious, but is really important to achieve models that are transferable and data efficient, is to be able to express a macroscopic property, say the energy, the polarizability of the entire system as a sum of contributions that are associated with each individual atom. So this additivity is basically what allows you to train your model on relatively simple systems and then being able to put the pieces back together and make a prediction for something much larger and on a global scale, much more complicated. So it turns out that once you make all of these requirements on the structure of the model, in a certain sense, your hands are tied. And even though over the past decade, there have been dozens of alternative frameworks that have been proposed to basically determine the link between an atomic structure and a suitable description that you can use in a machine learning model, actually, you can show that the vast majority of these models can be traced back to a single construction in which each atomic configuration is described by an endpoint correlation of the atom density. So those of you who are a little bit familiar with statistical mechanics will recall the pair correlation function or the three-body correlation function. Basically, the descriptors that are used are just a pointwise form of these correlation functions projected and discretized on an appropriate basis. And basically, different frameworks depend on the basis which is chosen and the way the projection is computed. Actually, you can generalize this construction in many different directions, and recently we have been able to show that even some deep learning frameworks based on message passing constructs can be expressed in an appropriate limit in the language of these atom-centered correlations. So, once you have sort of laid out the foundations of all of these techniques, it's interesting to give a brief overview of different applications that you can do that are made possible by all of these machinery. So for starters, something that used to be really, one of these heroic tasks, determining the finite temperature thermodynamics of a material from first principles, has now become relatively easy. I mean that this is something for which you used to have to write a grant to get access to a supercomputer for half a year. Now it's something that I'm not saying you can run on your laptop, but you can run in a small cluster at the university level. And for example, we were able to compute from first principles the melting point of water with an error of less than 5 Kelvin, including also the quantum mechanical nature of the nuclei, meaning that we can get a difference in melting point between light and heavy water. You can measure also very subtle free energy differences, for instance, that between hexagonal and cubic ice. And then, of course, since one of the nice aspects of doing calculations is that you can realize extreme conditions without the need for very expensive laboratory equipment or without having to send a probe in space, you can compute the thermodynamics of hydrogen in conditions that are found in the core of giant planets. You can also do something a little bit less exotic, compute a phase diagram for a binary system. This is gallium arsenide, and this is a phase diagram that is very useful to study the growth of some nanostructures. And something that you might notice here is that there is a considerable discrepancy between for instance, the melting point predicted for gallium arsenide and the experimental value. So at this point, one should ask oneself, well, is this the fault of the machine learning algorithm, or is this the fault of the reference electronic structure calculations that we're using to train it? And, you know, to address this question without having to do a first principle calculation, which would be prohibitively expensive, we have developed an uncertainty quantification scheme that allows us to put error bars on every quantity. And so, for instance, we can verify that the error here, the statistical error of the machine learning model is really small, and actually the discrepancy is due to the reference calculation. So we have to go back and train the model on a more sophisticated electronic structure method. So as I anticipated, it's not just the potential energy that you can compute, you can also evaluate all sorts of response properties. Many of these properties have a tensorial nature, which requires some tweaks to the structure of the model. I will not get into details, but once you have done these tweaks, you can, for instance, predict the tensorial polarizability of molecules. Once again, we use an atom-centered model, which means that we can predict effective atomic polarizabilities. So, for instance, when you have a conjugate system, the polarizability is larger in the plane of the molecule. And so if you have multiple molecules, given that your predictions are tensorial, they can sum up in the correct way, which helps a lot of transferability. You can also predict more sophisticated properties, such as the electron charge density. You can predict something like the electronic Hamiltonian. Think, for instance, to the self-consistent Hamiltonian from DFT or from Hartree-Fock. And something which is really nice is that given that we built a model that is fully symmetric, a lot of the symmetries that, for instance, occur when your molecule or your material has some point or space group symmetry are automatically built in. So, for instance, here for benzene that has D6H point group symmetry, if you try to learn a target Hamiltonian that is noisy, the machine learning model only learns the part that is symmetric, and automatically it gives you molecular orbitals that have the correct symmetries based on the character table of D6H. So given that you can predict potential and properties, you can also put these things together and simulate materials at finite temperature. For instance, study all the ferroelectric phase transition that occur in barium titanate, which is one of the paradigmatic ferroelectrics. And you can predict not only the thermodynamics of the phase transitions, but also what happens when there are these phase transitions in terms of the dielectric properties of this material. another example, and this slide that I really like, because so this is the heat capacity of nickel, and there is so much physics in here. So at low temperature, there is this strong deviation from the Dulong-Petit limit that you study as an undergraduate as one of the manifestations of the quantum mechanical nature of the nuclei. So in order to model this regime, you need very expensive path integral calculations, and these expensive calculations become completely inexpensive if you use a machine learning model. But now if you go at high temperature, even if you have a very good machine learning model trained on very accurate reference calculations, you can't capture the totality of the heat capacity, because close to the melting point, electronic excitations start to play an important role. And here we predict from machine learning also the electronic contribution to heat capacity, so that we can basically make a prediction of the full heat capacity. And we are still missing this peak, which is, of course, related to the ferromagnetic transition in nickel, but there are other groups that have already started incorporating magnetism in machine learning models of matter. Another example, this is actually really from the group of Volker Deringer. One of the nice aspects of machine learning models is that thanks to their atom-centered nature, they scale linearly with system size, which means that you can go to hundreds of thousands of atoms and study processes such as the phase transitions in amorphous silicon that really require large cells and long simulation times. Another example, you can model spectroscopies, here the IR and the Raman spectra in water, and you can really put all the physical terms. Here we are also incorporating the quantum dynamics of the nuclei that determines a substantial redshift of the stretching peaks. So, I hope that I gave you a good overview of what's the state of the art. And I think that it's fair to say that machine learning techniques have already allowed for an almost complete replacement of electronic structure calculations, of course, after you have trained the model on them. So, it's not really a complete replacement, it's more an enhancement or an extension of their reach. But, what else could be done? And here, something that I'm really excited about is the possibility of mixing and matching machine learning and physics-based methods. So what I mean here is basically to predict by machine learning some of the quantities that enter a atomistic calculation, but then combine them using physics-based expressions. So just as an example, this is actually a paper that appeared today. It's possible to compute the finite temperature Mermin free energy functional for an electron. So basically the finite temperature equivalent of the Bohr-Oppenheimer energy of an electron in a material. And it's possible to compute these by first predicting by machine learning the ground state energy and the ground state density of states. And then we combine these with an expression which is based basically on physical approximations, and this allows us, just using ground state calculations as a reference, basically we can compute the behavior of an electron, in this case in high pressure hydrogen, up to a temperature of 50,000 Kelvin. And I think that there is much more that can be done in this direction. So another aspect in which I think there is still quite some work to do is from the point of view of the mathematical foundations of these machine learning methods. Very often you basically get a machine learning framework as a sort of a pre-arranged product that contains already many choices made for you. And I think that by continuing in this process of understanding the different ingredients that enter the construction of one of these models, it will become possible, a little bit as one does now with electronic structure calculations, to set yourself the different parameters and build a customized machine learning model that is the best for the problem that you want to solve. Another aspect on which I think there is still a lot of work to do is in combining predictions from quantum calculations with experimental data to determine machine learning models that can perhaps be even more accurate than the reference electronic structure calculation they are trained on, thanks to corrections brought in by the training on experimental data. So to wrap up, I think that there is a very nice interplay between physics-based and data-driven modeling, at least in the field of atomistic modeling of matter. And I think that it's nice really to see the exchange of concepts from physics that enters basically as priors in a machine learning models, so symmetries, conservation laws, so on and so forth. But also, it's very interesting to see how the use of data-driven techniques makes it possible to push physics-based modeling of matter to new applications and new regimes. So thank you for listening, and I will basically now leave it to Yuna.
Thank you very much, Mika, for this quick, swift overview. I'd like to draw everyone's attention to the link in the chat function to the Slido website where you can ask questions. Please enter the first name of the speaker before you ask a question. So our next speaker is Una Kim from Cornell University. So Una, please.
Well, thank you. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me for this exciting opportunity. And it was wonderful to learn from Michaela's work that is slightly different perspective, like different angle. So Michaela talked about trying to model, predictively model what a collection of atoms would do when you form a material. Now, what I want to focus on is what to do with the data that you've measured, starting from the experimental side. So let's see if I can get the pointer going. So we want to go connect experimental data that's ever getting richer and more complex with theoretical insight, and trying to make this bridge, two-way bridge, can be challenging when we have more and more information available to us. And in some of those efforts, because our ability to ab initio simulate is also limited, one would like to also engage in using quantum systems, and that brings in new type of data. So what I want to talk about today is how using machine learning tools as data science tools can help us facilitate making these bridges a two-way bridge. So let me first talk about what the data-driven challenges are. Tunneling density of states, which is measured by putting the material of your interest in between two other materials. For instance, here it's a superconductor. You apply voltage and you have an insulator. Well, it's going to take a certain amount of voltage before you start having conductance. And this is tunneling conductance, which measures tunneling density of states. This was a highly informative graph that were foundational to the establishment of BCS theory of superconductivity. But fast forward to today, instead of having one curve, we have tens of thousands of curves, because these density of states are measured, tunneling spectra are measured at each position as a function of position with sub-angstrom scale resolution. X-ray diffraction in 1913, this is actually taken from this original article in Proceedings of Royal Society by Bragg and Bragg, father and son. They were trying to make sense of three peaks that they observed And they came up with the very first forward model for X-ray diffraction, which is to say, okay, let me assume there are planes of atoms, and let me consider what the interference signal would be with a single model parameter of the distance between the planes. This was a wildly successful model that is now taught in high school physics. It's called the Bragg condition for the interference. Now, fast forward to today, instead of measuring 3 peaks, we can measure amount of data that quickly reaches terabytes. So with all this information that we can collect, there's got to be more we can learn about the system. But the challenge is, what can we do with this volume of data? Projective measurements, this is a plaque celebrating the Stern-Gerlach experiment that we also often learn in the introductory quantum mechanics topic. What this showed was that what seems to be a single polarized beam of electrons, silver atoms, would actually have 2 different states superposed in it. Now, this type of projective measurement was probing a Hilbert space of single spin, but fast forward to today, we can now study Hilbert space of 256 qubits. So how can we use machine learning to meet the data-driven challenges and make the most of the data that's available to us, make a bridge to theoretical insight, and use the theory to predict what should happen in new measurement? Now, these tools are, the machine learning tools are like any other tools. There are different types of tools. This is a hand-driven, hand crank drill. You can make a hole with it, but if you have a power drill, you can not only make a hole much faster over many more boards, but by changing bits, you can do other things than just making a hole. With a powerful tool like a power drill, always there will be a warning, safety warning. And the safety warning here is that if we take a method off the shelf and just throw it at a given problem of interest, first of all, the model that we use would give us some result, but we may not know why it is giving us the result, and therefore we may not know whether we can trust the result. So there has to be, as Michele pointed out, there has to be the interplay between physical ideas and intuition and benchmark and the tools that we can use to facilitate dealing with larger and more complex data. So I want to just showcase 2 example cases. One is supervised machine learning for hypothesis testing. Oftentimes, when experiments are done, it's done with some hypothesis in mind. The experimentalist is throwing out a question: what is the right way to think about a certain phenomena? Under a hypothesis, they design the experiment and carry out the experiment. Now, when you look at the data because of the real life perturbations, data never looks exactly like what one would have drawn in with just the ideas alone. So then from that data, how do you know which hypothesis, once you introduce noise, would better describe the underlying phenomena? We approach this problem as discriminating among different hypotheses as discriminating among different number, for instance, in the handwritten digit recognition or any other image recognition problem. So how does supervised learning work? Well, to think about supervised learning, I first thought about training kids. So this poor kid has to make a decision upon dropping precious ice cream. And when kids drop food, they are going to take input, such as how long it has been since the food has dropped, whether your mother or father, the bad cop parent is watching, how sweet is it? For my kids, how green is it? This is also an important question. So you take these input, and then you're trying to come up with an output. for the case of our data, we're trying to come out with an output of which of the following hypotheses best describe my data, given the input. Now, the input should be treated as a vector, and different parts of the brain will put different amount of emphasis on different pieces of the data. So that process can be thought of as there being a matrix connecting the input vector, x1, x2, x3 components to a particular neuron. So there is a matrix, that's the weight matrix, and different neurons would have different bias, and here's the bias vector. And the whole linear combination going through a nonlinear function would give expressibility. So if this is how the decision is made, given the weights and bias, the training process is trying to let the neural network or a child adjust its own weights and biases to come out with the decision that we believe is the correct decision. At the end of the day, the whole process can be thought of as writing a function that's mapping the input to the decision space. And once we think of it as a function, we can make the function more and more complex by increasing the number of hidden layers or by introducing intermediate steps such as convolutional mapping. So we went through this whole process for this a whole decade worth of data collected by my colleague Seamus Davis, who has studied high TC cuprate materials with scanning tunneling microscopy. So this is scanning tunneling microscopy data. You can see the scale from the scale bar. So we have analyzed a decade's collection of data to assess from this data set whether underlying this beautiful but irregular pattern repeating seemingly some fixed set of motifs is best described starting from momentum space or free fermions, thinking starting from the Fermi surface nesting, or should we start from sort of a local starting point where there are spins at the copper sites that have filling, and we introduce holes, they get doped into the oxygen sites, and the frustration of spin interaction between this hole and this copper and between the copper and copper is leading to this pattern formation. So with each of these hypotheses, we generated training data, and we trained neural network to tell the different the data generated from different hypotheses apart. And then we gave the real data to the neural network. The outcome was to favor real space or strong coupling limit starting point. And that gave us a new way to look at the decades collection of the data, having previously unrecognized universality, that in all of those data sets, there underlies organizational principle where the dominant motif is period 4 charge modulations that are unidirectional, that's running in one direction, and lattice commensurate. And now we are investigating how these observations can help us better understand mysteries of high TC cuprate. Now, what about unsupervised learning? So what I showed earlier was an example of supervised learning where we have labeled training set, and we trained the neural network to learn to distinguish different labels, and then we give the real data and see we give the previously unseen data and have neural network decide which hypothesis best describe the data. Now this it has built-in bias because the labeling and the selection of training set and the hypothesis were chosen by the researcher. Now, can we make progress in learning without such presupposed bias? So this is a illustration showing a large volume of X-ray data as the data set evolves as a function of temperature. If we want to study the evolution of data as a function of temperature, and from that learn some theme, some trend, how can we do that? And that's what was described in this recent publication. So if I want to find a special piece from this large, embarrassingly large pile of Lego, which I was often asked to do during pandemic, we quickly learned picking up one piece at a time and trying to see whether that's the piece that I'm searching for is not a good strategy. We get tired, we start to kind of blank out, and we miss the piece. Then how do we approach looking for that special piece or looking for something interesting in large pile of data? Well, you want to start by sorting. So if you are dealing with Lego, a natural choice would be sorting by color. What if you're dealing with X-ray data? What would be a natural choice of sorting? How can you introduce some sort of criteria without presupposed bias, but something that will capture what we are interested in? So by emergence here, I mean collective phenomena driven by interaction, which is there is my Hamiltonian, which is giving me energy. And then there is entropy, which is always trying to maximize. And the balance is given by temperature. As I lower the temperature, I will see more of the cooperative effect driven by Hamiltonian. And watching how the data evolves as a function of temperature will tell me which part to look at that is meaningful. So now we're going to treat the different momentum space positions as reciprocal space positions as if they are population. And we track the X-ray intensity or any diffraction intensity or scattering intensity as a series sitting on each of those sites. We treat this as a sort of lifetime of a person. So person here is a particular Q point, and the lifetime trend is a temperature series. What can we be learning in X-ray? We can learn about periodicity changing, that is unicell changing features such as charge density wave. We can also learn features that do not change the unicell size, but change structure inside the unicell, such as intra-unicell order. We can also learn about fluctuations. So the example that I want to highlight here, where we had a successful application, very first application, it was a pyrochlorocadmium renate, which is a material that eventually goes superconducting. But before going superconducting, starting from room temperature, it first goes through a sequence of structural transitions. This particular transition has large specific heat signal, but the displacement showing the structural change is at a picometer scale. Now, picometer scale, that is smaller than size of hydrogen atom. It's a very small scale. And what can we learn about what's happening at picometer scale, which is changing the symmetry property of the system, making it lose inversion symmetry. So we get 8 terabytes of data from our experimentalist colleagues, and we put it through our algorithm, X-ray temperature series clustering, XTEC. And in 10 minutes, we get the outcome of that sorting all this collection of temperature series into a representative behavior. So these two these two curves are showing a representation of one cluster compared to a representation of another cluster. This is mean, this is variance. And this tells me in this mess, in this soup, there are reciprocal space points that are behaving like order parameter, and there are points that are behaving like noise. This is very quick to do. Now, once we get to this point, we want to start learning a little more detail. And given the limited time, I'm not going to go into the further detail, but let me just brag about the discoveries enabled by this tool. First of all, we learned that there is out of sync displacement between cadmium and rhenium. And this out of sync distance is 0.05 angstrom scale. However, the fact that they become out of sync changes the symmetry of the system. Furthermore, we were able to detect Goldstone mode associated with this two-dimensional order parameter living in nearly degenerate space and this Goldstone mode fluctuation was detected by studying the fluctuation effects, diffuse signal from the data. So to summarize, I made a case for using machine learning tools to learn about emergent phenomena in quantum matter data as the data becomes richer and more complex and larger in volume. I went over how one could use supervised machine learning to do hypothesis testing, and also unsupervised machine learning to cluster and accelerate discoveries. I think of the present moment to be sort of like replay of this moment. This is seen from Hidden Figures, where these group of human computers learned how to program a new big giant machine, and they transitioned successfully from being human computers who were replaced by machines to programmers programming the big machine to calculate the trajectory for NASA. I think we're at that moment where we can learn to use these tools and accelerate discoveries and become capable of looking at a rich set of data that are now pouring out in a comprehensive manner. With that, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, and thanks to both of you for these exciting talks. We have some questions. So first, to Una, Professor Kim, the processing conditions for the sample material could influence the XRD data. Can your model pick up such effects, such uncertainties?
Okay, so the question is how we do the pre-processing can affect what we can learn from data. Is that, and can we pick up the effect of such pre-processing? That's the question, right? Okay. So answer is yes. So that's where the human machine engagement and synergy happen in two places, in the pre-processing stage and in interpretation of the outcome stage. Depending on the pre-processing, we will learn things that are meaningful, or sometimes we will just pick up not so useful information. For instance, once we got really excited and learned that there was some glitch in the system, the experimental system, where somebody banged something really hard. So what we do is a lot sort of a feedback cycle. We try a pre-processing, we get to the end, and we see whether we can make sense out of the result. And if we can make sense out of the result, that pre-processing was well functioning. If we cannot make sense out of the result, we have to go back and ask, did we do the most effective pre-processing? Because no machine can replace human intelligence, asking for trying to decide on the pre-processing that are insightful for the scientific question that we're after is absolutely important role human researcher plays. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you. The question for Michela, which GNN ready-made free packages would you recommend for someone who wants to use them and train for specific problems? Somewhat of a leading question.
Okay, I probably wouldn't use a GNN, at least not one based on interatomic distances only. No, there are many packages. I would say that we are still in a phase where most of the packages are undergoing a lot of development. So it depends a lot on really what you want to do. And I have heard good things in terms of user friendliness for the DeepMD package. Seems like it's comparatively easy to use, but otherwise, if there is the well, there is the good old Quip package from Gabor, but I don't know if you would still recommend it. It's definitely very stable and time-tested. Snap from Sandia. It's also quite easy to use. And then there are a number of recent packages that use linear regression, but with sophisticated many-body features. And here there is PACE, MACE, there is MTP. There is really a lot. So I don't know, pick your poison.
Mm-hmm. Good. Next question, Tuna, is how easy it is to understand the trends that you've picked up in terms of the known physical knowledge that we know already. Do you pick up sort of trivial things, or how do you purge the trends that you pick up so that you only have the non-trivial things?
Very good question. So often we approach the problems with a set of benchmarks. So we want to make sure we can pick up trivial things. We want to pick up not necessarily trivial, but we want to make sure we can pick up things that are known, that we know how to think about. And once that is cleared, then we try to see whether we can go beyond that. So when we are looking at X-ray data, for instance, we will pick up the ordering temperature very easily. We will pick up the ordering wave vectors, and we can go look at whether that wave vector is the wave vector that we would have thought of based on pre-existing knowledge. And then we can see whether there are additional ordering happening at temperatures that were not previously detected, what is happening with the fluctuations in the diffuse signal. So we try to always build on something that we know.
Mm-hmm. Just a reminder to the attendees that you can also post your questions into the Zoom chat as well as the Slido. I have a generic question to both of you, which is: do you see do you see the role of ML in materials science and materials physics as mostly sort of a slightly better drill, something that is cheaper or speeds things up a little bit, or is it transformational? Do you see it? Does it enable things that we couldn't do before, kind of regardless of how expensive it was? Una first.
So I was reading a book about Ada Lovelace, who was the first programmer. And at the time, the idea of making this machine that can compute was driven by the notion that people who were working on calculating the logarithms for the table of logarithms, it was just too expensive. And once you burn a big table of logarithm, to regenerate it was going to take 10 years. And it required a whole lot of people sitting in a building calculating. And wouldn't it be nice if you can have a machine that would do that? Of course, none of us use a table of logarithms today, although it is in principle possible. Why? Right? Today I can ask Alexa, what is log 2? Alexa will answer me. So that I think of speeding up as enabling, allowing us to do things that were not possible, because even if it is in principle possible in the age of universe, none of us live the age of universe. Definitely graduate students don't stay for age of universe, and they shouldn't.
Mm-hmm. Michele?
Yeah, I sort of agree with Una. I mean, you say whether it is just a tool, as being just a tool was something reductive, but a lot, or if not all, of the scientific revolutions have been driven by the development of a new tool. So I would say that in many cases, the speed up that you can achieve is truly transformative. And I would also say that something that neither Una nor I have touched upon, but there are also attempts to use machine learning to solve many-body the many-body quantum problem, like, build better ansatses for variational wave functions and so on and so forth. And there, I would say that, thinking in terms of a machine learning framework allows you to do things that wouldn't have been possible with previous techniques.
So here's a technical question. So a lot of physics, particularly experimental support work, was for a long time done at using sort of low-level computer languages. So Fortran, of course, is very heavily used in physics. What do you use in particular? Do you use modern top-level languages or Python, or do you think that when we come to the big experiments and physics or big calculations, we're back to C and Fortran? Una?
I use Python.
Mm-hmm. And you find that the experimentalist that's compatible with
yes, many
your
experimentalists use Python.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was one case where we were trying to interface with Fortran, I don't know, 77, and we eventually gave up.
Michele?
I couldn't pay anybody enough to do that.
So yeah, I'm mostly using Python, and I'm learning Rust.
What is that?
Rust is a compiled language. It's basically it's vaguely similar. It's a kind of the syntax is halfway between C and Python, but it's compiled and it's very good for parallelism. But no, I would say it's mostly Python. And actually, the point with Python is actually that there are a number of dialects. So if you use PyTorch or NumPy, it's almost as an entirely different programming language. So
here's a follow-up question. Do you use pre-built optimization and fitting techniques, tools like scikit-learn, or do you build custom neural networks? Again, Una first.
So we started with custom neural networks, something as simple as what you pick up from a textbook, and then we were using scikit-learn. Often we start from what's available, or we try to build on what's available, but often we find we have to customize to some degree. Sometimes we just write it ourselves, but often we need customization because what's available off the shelf are not working with the same kind of constraints. Like we want to make sure there's a symmetry, but that was not important for self-driving cars. So we need to think about what is our problem and what portion of our problem matches the everyday world problem many of these packages are written for, and where we need to introduce new aspects, new constraints, and new criteria.
Okay, Michele?
It's fun.
We started doing our own, and we definitely switched to using as much as possible pre-existing packages, also because you make it easier to users. Actually, when we implement something ourselves now, we try to mimic the syntax and the the usage patterns of existing packages, just because you tap into this huge community of users and developers. So it's really worth to stick with the standard tools, I think.
Okay, so I think Una has to leave for official business. So thank you very much for your talk and for answering the questions. And there's one more question for Michele. What new science could you learn from real atomistic simulations on a quantum computer, as originally suggested by Feynman?
Ooh. So I don't know. I think that the question of whether so there is this interesting and very controversial paper on the archive, which asks the question of whether exponential quantum supremacy for quantum chemistry will ever be possible. Which is, I think it's an interesting question, because the idea behind using a quantum computer to simulate a quantum system is that somehow a quantum computer is ideally adapted to the problem. But it turns out that apparently you can prove mathematically that for an arbitrary quantum chemical system, even a quantum algorithm will be exponential. Basically, if you have infinite correlations, infinite extent of correlations, then even a quantum algorithm would take an exponential time. And if there are no infinite length correlations, then most of the time you can come up with classical heuristics that are not exponential. So I think it's an interesting question, and it's not necessarily the case that a quantum computer will allow to simulate something that if you're smart enough, you cannot simulate with a classical algorithm.
And but of course, some of the machine learning algorithms, the classical ones, if I can implement them on the quantum computer,
yeah,
goes backwards, right?
Well, but in general, this is
that's not the Feynman suggestion, but
in the field of machine learning, usually is the optimization, right? Is the training, whether you can get a better fitting. Yeah, no, I don't know. This is not really a field in which I'm very active, and so I don't want to make predictions. My impression is that we will be able to do a lot of exciting stuff with classical computer in the near future, and perhaps in 10 years from now we will have something even more exciting on a quantum computer.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, especially for answering the questions at length, and thanks both to Una and Michele. And I would like to remind the audience that the next event in this series of online seminars is going to be continuing with machine learning in fluid dynamics and climate physics. It's at the same time next Wednesday. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody.